Good morning. Whoa. Chris, I am a little loud, a little hot. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm going to talk in my normal voice and let you adjust the volume, okay? Thank you. Good morning. Glad you are here. That is woke up. We're down a little bit, but we have a bunch of people across the alleyway. So glad that you're here. We are finishing up reading through the Bible, our year-long project here. So there's reading schedules in the back, I think. I did not lay my eyes on them this morning. We are into the last 2 weeks of the year, reading through the Bible. So I don't know where they went to. There were still a couple of journals last week. I'm not sure where they went to, if you want to finish that up. And we've been asking the question and continue to ask the question as we read, what is important to God? What stands out to you? What have you learned this time through? This past week, the readings were Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter. And like it says, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter. Because I want to spend this morning in Hebrews unless there's something that you just have to say about 1st and 2nd Peter. And part of that reasoning is because John and Jeff are going to be teaching in 1st and 2nd Peter for the month of October. Okay? So I'm going to ease you back into slowing down and not covering so much text at 1 week. And then November and December is the book of Revelation. So in the next 2 weeks, you will read through all of that if you stay on the reading schedule to finish that up. But so that's what's coming in October and November and December. And I'm going to let John have a few seconds at the end of class to tell you what to do to get ready for next week. So, Hebrews this morning, if you've read through it, let me ask you this question, since I asked it before about James. A lot of people like Hebrews and a lot of book of Hebrews, and some people don't like the book of Hebrews. So it's kind of one of those deals. How many of you like the book of Hebrews? And how many of you are going, I'm not real thrilled about it? Okay. Some of you have no opinion at all. Okay. The book of Hebrews is interesting. It is a general epistle, general letter, because it is not addressed to, we call it general because it's not addressed to a specific person or a group of people at a specific place. In fact, if you open your Bibles to Hebrews, the first chapter, you'll notice it has no address or salutation at all, which also makes it unusual in the New Testament. It just starts off talking. I don't know if that part of the original papyrus got torn off or what happened to it. Back when the early church was putting the canon together, a lot of people thought Hebrews shouldn't be included because we don't know where it's going. But there are some things about it. But it made it in because the theme of the book throughout the entire book is that Jesus and his covenant are superior to Moses and that covenant. Don't go back to the inferior. From what is said in the book, apparently being written to these Hebrew Christians, who, as John is fond of saying, they were still meeting in the synagogue. They were being tempted to go back to the completely Old Testament way of living and offering sacrifices and abandoning faith in Jesus. And so this letter was written to them saying, don't do that, and here's a bunch of reasons why. But we don't know who wrote it. It's not ascribed anywhere, but there are some internal clues. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 3 says something interesting when he is talking about one of the warnings, which we'll get to in a minute. It says that the salvation, it was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard, while God also bore witness. So it would seem to say that whoever is writing this was not one of the original disciples of Jesus. In other words, he's saying, I didn't hear it personally, but it was attested to us by those who heard. And although some people think it was the Apostle Paul, because he wasn't there, yet Apostle Paul in Galatians 2 says, well, nobody taught me the gospel. I received it as a direct revelation from Jesus. Excuse me, that's Galatians 1, verses 11 and 12. But yet, maybe. We also know when you look at the end of the letter in Hebrews 13, he talks about in verse 23 that our brother Timothy has been released, with whom I shall see you if he comes soon. So he's in that network of co-workers, contemporaries with Timothy. But exactly who that would be, that's a good question. One thing, just because of the way the letter is written, it refers so much to the temple worship and the whole Mosaical covenant way of life, that whoever wrote it was very familiar with that, and so familiar with it that in all probability he was also a Hebrew. There's a good case for that, and he's writing it to people who are also very familiar with it. But we don't know. And it's been argued for back and forth for probably 2,000 years now, and we're not going to settle it this morning. But people that have been put forth have been Paul and Peter and Apollos and Barnabas. Even Luke has been put forward. So all of them are possible. I also think it's completely possible, because I know the real author is God. It could be somebody we've not even read about in the New Testament. That God wrote it. It's just too deep and spiritual of a book not to be from God. So that's interesting. And it is usually divided. There's several different ways of outlining it, which is probably one of the reasons, if you remember, I didn't like James, because it's completely illogical. Just jumps from image to image. But Hebrews is very logical and written and has some great images, but it's easily outlined. So I like it. I can follow this along. There are five sections, and in each section there is both an exhortation, a teaching, saying here's what is good, how you need to be living, and by the way, there are consequences if you don't live that way. Here's what you need to do, and here's what's going to happen if you don't do it. Did you ever deal with your kids that way? Okay, this is what you need to do, and there will be blessings if you do it, and punishment if you don't. If you don't want the blessings, you at least need to avoid the punishment, right? We want to make sure that this gets done. In doing my research, I came across a couple of tips from the Bible Project, which I thought were great. The first tip to understanding Hebrews is, when you see a quote from the Old Testament, go back and read the entire context of that quote. It's it's a little bit like, well, the quote itself is great and it makes sense, but there is such a depth if you understand the context of that quote that it came from. I think in our American culture, if you hear somebody starts off with 7 years ago, you immediately think of all the context of the Gettysburg Address. Or we say, we the people of the United States, and you start thinking in terms of the Constitution. So to people that are familiar with, who have studied and memorized the Old Testament, or at least big chunks of the Old Testament, when they hear this quote out of the Old Testament, they're not thinking about just that passage. They remember the entire context of what's going on there, and then applying that to the current situation that in which they're living. The second thing is, in each of these sections, there is a warning, and the warning should make you feel uncomfortable, but not fearful. That's what it's designed to do. I mean, that's what the author wants, is that you should be uncomfortable about this, because it is a fearful thing. That being said, any general comments you want to make about Hebrews? Favorite passages? Favorite links?
Like you were saying, it's good to not just take the one thing they're quoting, but go back and have the context.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's good to read this whole book and not just pull one verse out of it here and one verse out of it here
Mm-hmm.
to prove your point or back up whatever you're,
Yeah.
the whole context of this also, because it's an argument. It's a, it's
Mm-hmm.
something that he's laying out. So that applies, I think.
Yeah,
Same idea.
to read through the whole thing at once and just sit down, because it only takes, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes maybe if you read the whole thing through. I mean, it was, after all, written as a letter to a church that was read all at one time. And you're right, it does give a different perspective. John.
I think it was in high school, we were at a lectureship up in the Northwest, and the theme was Hebrews, and I can't remember who was the keynote speaker, but the way he described the book of Hebrews, it was a very visual image, and it's always helped me. He says it was like a big tent meeting that they were having, and all the Jewish Christians were leaving and saying, it's not worth it, we're going back, this is too expensive, and we're leaving. And it was like the preacher had run out in front of them and hopped up on the back of the flatbed truck and made one last appeal. And so that image is always...
Yeah. Okay. It's not directly related to Hebrews, but I think it was Glenn Pemberton, an Old Testament teacher. When he talked about the Mosaical covenant, it was a very visual thing too. It was the holiest place in the universe is the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. And the closer you could get to that, the holier you were. And only the high priest with blood could go in there once a year. And then only Levitical priests, descendants of Aaron, could go into the holy place just on the other side of the curtain daily to service that, to service the altar and the incense and the candles. And then priests and men could come into the outer court and offer sacrifices. But women could only come into the outside court, and the Gentiles couldn't even come into that. And so it was, how close can you get to the mercy seat of God? And that plays into this book as well. I will confess to you that one of the first times I was reading through and studying, and it was probably in high school, in the book of Hebrews, and I'm reading the first 5 chapters, and I am really into it and thinking, this is deep stuff. It was, wow. And I get to chapter 6 and it goes, okay, enough about the elementary stuff. I went, what? You know, and we need to talk about the elementary stuff, but we're going to leave this elementary stuff and get on to more mature stuff. And I went, most of what I grew up hearing in sermons was all about what he calls elementary stuff. And I went, oh, I've got a whole lot more to learn, and I don't even know what it is. So, still trying to learn. Anything else? Your experiences with Hebrews? Okay, well, let's take the next 25 minutes, almost 30 minutes, and go through some of this. The first section is chapters 1 and 2. The author makes the argument that Jesus is superior to angels and to the Torah, basically the Old Testament, the first 5 books, that he is superior to that. I pulled out as a key verse of that, Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 4, which reads this way. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. And Brandon and I did not coordinate this morning about the communion talk. But what a picture of the vastness of this universe in which we live. And he created all that. You know? And so he's saying Jesus is superior to this and to the angels. He also goes on to make the argument that a lot of the Mosaical covenant was instituted by angels, was given by angels. You see angels appearing throughout in the Old Testament. But in Hebrews 2, verses 1 through 4, he has this warning. Again, remember, this is designed to make you feel uncomfortable, but not fearful. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard, while God also bore witness by signs and wonders and various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. What do you think? What are you going to do? Jumped up on the tailgate. Said, wait a minute, you don't want to leave this. Take a look at what you know. How great, and basically he's building up the Mosaical covenants, and it's a good thing, but this is better. Hebrews is very much a book that the more you understand about the Old Testament and those really hard books in the Torah to read through, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, the more you get in and understand those books, all of a sudden it adds a huge depth to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. Section 2. Second section is the third and fourth chapters of the book of Hebrews. That Jesus is superior to the Moses and to even the promised land. Hebrews 3, verses 1 through 3 reads this way. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in heaven in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. To the Hebrews, Moses was the greatest leader ever. He and King David. You know. And do you recall the words of Jesus when the people said, they were wanting a sign from Jesus, and they said, what sign do you give us? Moses gave us bread. And Jesus' reply was, Moses didn't give you bread. That was my Father. You have elevated Moses. Moses is not the one you should be learning about here. It's my Father. And Jesus is superior to Moses. And he lists a lot of reasons to that. And he says, Moses brought you into the promised land. This is what was promised to you. But actually, you have not entered into God's rest. Because they did not enter into it. He talks about that whole generation that died in the wilderness because they were disobedient. Don't be disobedient like them. Read Hebrews 4, verses 1 through 2. Therefore, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to read from the English Standard Version, but then I want to talk about a difference in the New International Version. Hebrews 4, 1 and 2, English Standard Version. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. How many of you have the New International Version with you? Reads a little bit differently, and it has a trigger word for me when it says in verse 2, for we also, in the New International, for we also have had the gospel preached to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them because those who heard did not combine it with faith. I don't know about you, but gospel is a trigger word for me than just good news. Do you react differently to the two? Is it just me? I grew up so much about gospel preachers, and we have the gospel, and the gospel had a very specific definition. The message that Jesus was crucified and buried and raised on the third day, according to the scriptures. That's the gospel. And good news is much more general. You know, gospel is only church. Good news can be any good news. You know, but gospel is this very specific thing. At least that's what I was taught. And I still have a reaction to that. Because actually, Friday night, my iPad locked up on me. As in disabled, connected to iTunes, I am not going to let you in. which meant I lost an hour Saturday morning at the Apple store getting it completely wiped out and reworked, redone. Luckily, it had been backed up, and it's still throwing up some different things to me. So what happened was I pulled out one of my hard copy Bibles, which was a New International Version, and I was reading through, and it went, well, the gospel was preached to us just as to them. And I went, the gospel? Wait a minute, the implication to them is that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus was preached to them? Wait a minute. How is that even possible? What is this good news? I mean, I've had this bouncing around in the back of my brain for a long time. That the gospel is good news beyond just the death, burial, and resurrection, just those events of history. And this is not completely formed yet in my own mind, so I'm just kind of verbalizing out loud. The gospel is the good news of salvation of God. It's good news. And part of what Hebrews is saying all the way through this is not that those people were saved under the Mosaical covenant. What they did, those sacrifices, did not save them. What saved them was faith in God. We're gonna keep bouncing around this. But whatever it is, I have to reconcile the fact that the Jews in the wilderness had the gospel preached to them, and the word there is preached. It's the verb form. It's euangelizo. If you grew up hearing the sermons I heard, it was, well, no, the gospel is euangelion. That's the noun verb. Euangelizo is the verb form. It means preaching good news. That's literally the word. Jacob.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that, so this part in 4 is talking about faith, and so is the end of verse 3, or chapter 3, verse 19 talks about, he's saying the people didn't enter because of lack of faith. But then in chapter 4, he continues to say in verse 6 that they don't enter without obedience as well.
Mm-hmm.
It is both.
It is both.
Obedience, and that lack of faith is a lack of obedience. Same vice versa is true as well. So lack of obedience is proof of a lack of faith.
Same as James and Paul. Yeah, it all marries together. Brad. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a little bit what Daryl's going to be talking about over the next few weeks in his sermon series. What does it mean to be a disciple? Are you actually making the change in your life? And that's what these are. And apparently these people have made a change, but are going back to their old ways. Section 3. Jesus is superior as to the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, and even to the priesthood of Melchizedek, which if you're not familiar with that story, it's an amazing story. 5 through 10. I'm going to have to breeze through this. Anyway, those verses talk about Jesus is superior to that. I'm going to skip down. So also, verse 5, so also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. As he says also in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And he goes on to make the argument that Melchizedek is superior to the Levitical priesthood because, Levi was still in Abraham's loins when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. And Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and the lesser is never blessed by the greater. The greater blesses the lesser. And Jesus is superior even to Melchizedek because not only is he priest in that order, he is the son. Hebrews 6, which is one of the scarier warnings. Hebrews 6, 4 through 6. For it is impossible in the case of those who have once been enlightened, who have tasted the heavenly gift, and have shared in the Holy Spirit, and have tasted the goodness of the Word of God and the powers of the age to come, and then have fallen away, to restore them again to repentance, since they are crucifying once again the Son of God to their own harm and holding him up to contempt. That should make you very uncomfortable. But you also need to remember that the writer also wrote 3 verses later in verse 9. I want to pull up the whole thing. I just have a message here. Though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things, things that belong to salvation. I mean, it's a harsh warning, but I don't think you're going to go there. What a great encouragement that is. The fourth section, chapters 8 through 10, talk about Jesus' sacrifice, and his new covenant is better than the old covenant. Hebrews 8, 1, 2, verse 6. Now the point of what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. There's the whole thing that the tabernacle that Moses built, they built in the wilderness, was an amazing thing, and it was the place where, as we said, which transferred into the temple later, the mercy seat of God was, the holiest place in the universe. And this writer points out that what Moses built, what David and Solomon built, what was rebuilt, was a copy of the original. Because when it was told, God told Moses, you build that just like the original you saw in heaven, I showed you. The original is there. And it talks about Jesus making his sacrifice, not here in the copy, but a better sacrifice, which was his own blood, that he took into the original, the true Holy of Holies in heaven, And he only had to do it once, not year after year after year, like is done in the copy. Only once. And now then, that way is open to you, to us. But the warning, Hebrews, yes.
With that imagery, is it possible that that makes me think differently about the tearing of the temple veil, that line.
Okay.
I always think of the temple veil being torn from the inside out, that we're now welcome. But maybe what it was, another way to think about it is it was torn from the outside in because Jesus, as a man, goes through, with his blood, goes through from the outside in to offer the sacrifice once and for all.
Yeah. But it wasn't by a man on the ground because it was not from the bottom up, it was from the top down.
But I'm saying that Jesus, if
Yeah.
what we're saying is that Jesus took his, and of course this is just banter, but if Jesus took his blood to be offered in the actual original sanctuary,
He was coming outside in
he was coming outside in,
because he had been outside.
right?
Yeah. Incredible stuff. The warning in chapter 10, verses 26 to 27, for if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. You don't want to go back to the old way. And in the Old Testament, and there's a couple other quotes in Hebrews at the end of chapter 10 and the end of chapter 12. I've always wanted to make a sermon out of these two. Never figured out exactly how to do it. But it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Wouldn't be fearful to fall into an idol because it's not a real God and it's not alive. Our God is alive. And he is, in the Old Testament, he is listed as a consuming fire. If you've been around fires much, there are fires that burn things, and then there are fires that just absolutely consume everything, and nothing is left but ash. And our God is a consuming fire. That's the word that was used when God came down on top of Mount Sinai. It was a consuming fire. Final section. Jesus is superior to, faith in Jesus is superior to the Mosaical law and to the works of those law. And the thing that probably stood out to me more than ever before this time in studying and reading through this multiple times is that the people that were under the Mosaical law and even those who were before the Mosaical law, they were saved by faith, just like us, or we just like them. Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 2. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, for by it the people of old received their commendation. I focused for so long on the definition of faith and missed the next line. That assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, is why people of old were commended. And it lists those great people. A lot of great people. A lot of people I did not grow up thinking of were that great. Samson was a judge, but Samson had his issues, right? Rahab, the prostitute. How did that? And John likes to make us think about the people in the Old Testament that you think are really great and who are not listed there. Sarah? I mean, you list Rahab, but you don't list Sarah? But I don't think that was meant to be an exhaustive list either. But all of them were commended not because of what they did, and they did some amazing and incredible things and were completely faithful. And there were people who we don't even know their names, who suffered death in the persecution, especially in Persia from the Assyrians. Historically, there are some awful, brutal things they did to the Hebrews that are mentioned in here. There is one that talks, Hebrews talks about they were sawn in half. It's not in the Bible, but the Jewish teaching is that the prophet Isaiah was fleeing from the king and hid inside a hollow tree. And what they did when they found him was they didn't let him out of the tree. They just cut the tree in half with him in it. So brutal things. But it ends up by saying, see that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. We have been given such great news. Don't go back to the old ways of your life. Even though we won't go back to offering sacrifices in the temple, but we all have old ways of life. And what we have in Jesus, in our faith in God and in him, is so much greater. We just have to make sure we focus on the right things and being the right kind of people. And it's not easy. Don't hear me say that. But it is better. And so that's kind of a very quick overview of Hebrews. Anything else you want to add? Something else that stands out to you? And we'll give John a couple of minutes here to talk about next week or two.
So we had talked about going right into Revelation right after this reading, but I'm going to be gone a week and Daryl's going to be gone 2 weeks. So we decided probably not to have guest speakers for that 2-week period. We're going to do 1st and 2nd Peter, and then the last week of October, we're going to do Jude. And I think they're really good lineup books, if you will, warm-up books for Revelation. Peter, as we know, Peter's one of the apostles, and Peter does a lot of crazy stuff as he's following Jesus, and now we get him later in life, and he's giving some very strong discipleship admonition to the church, which is culturally a pretty common time for what we're experiencing. The church is experiencing cultural persecution, not a lot at this point of physical, deathly persecution, but certainly they're not culturally welcomed. So I would encourage you over the next week or two just to read 1 Peter. I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks the 1 Peter, and then Jeff's going to do 2 Peter for 2 weeks, and then we're going to do Jude for a week. But I would encourage you to read those. 1 and 2 Peter is chock full of verses that we use. There are so many verses out of 1 and 2 Peter that you're going to recognize, but they are actually part of a long argument, just like Hebrews.